In 2007, Marvel Comics released One More Day, a comic so controversial some called it the worst thing to happen to America since New Jersey. The comic featured everyone's favourite hero Spider-Man doing a deal with the devil, and in doing so erased his marriage with Mary Jane Watson from existence. This comic came right after the Civil War event, in which Spider-Man had revealed his identity to the world and put his loved ones in danger. After Aunt May was shot by a bullet meant for him, Peter rushes her to the hospital and calls everyone he can think of for help. Iron Man, Doctor Strange, Reed Richards. But for some magic reason, none of them can help. At the end of the day, the only person who can save his aunt is the hell demon Mephisto. Mephisto offers him a deal. He'll save Aunt May's life, he'll make everyone forget that Peter Parker is Spider-Man, on one condition. Peter must give up his marriage with MJ, his memories of their time together, this love that completed him. In order to save his aunt, the world that he built with his wife must come to an end. Now, the weird thing about this story is that, on the surface, nothing really sticks out. The dialogue is beautifully written, and while I'm not the biggest fan of Joe Quesada's art, I can still appreciate the craft on display. When I gave this comic to my friends, who aren't really familiar with Spider-Man, they didn't think it was that bad. But if you ask any Spider-Man fans, they'll cite this as the worst Spider-Man story of all time, the point of no return which ruined Spider-Man comics forever. One IGN reviewer said that it ruined his Christmas, and you know IGN, they'd give their own mother's funeral a 10 if they could. If they're the ones saying this, it's gotta be pretty bad. What I want to do here is give you context, because it's one thing to say that this story is bad, okay, very few people will disagree with me, but understanding exactly what it is that turns people off, and how something like this gets to be made, I think that's a bit more valuable. Because to me, this story doesn't just mistreat the character of Spider-Man, it completely betrays the principles his whole character was built upon. Peter isn't just betraying Mary Jane, he's betraying himself. Through the actions he takes in this story, he might as well be spitting on Uncle Ben's grave. This might sound obvious, but a good story should be tied together by a theme, a governing idea, an argument you're trying to prove. Usually this message is proven naturally through the events of the story, but in the case of Spider-Man's first comic, they just tell you that message at the end. Now, in a previous video, I said something very, very stupid. In fact, it wasn't really what I said, but more what I didn't say. I brought up the fact that Uncle Ben doesn't play much of a role in the original Spider-Man comics, and while this is technically true, Uncle Ben barely appears in the first issue. He wakes Peter up for school, tells him not to get fat, and spends the rest of the issue standing ominously in the background. Then he dies off screen, and Peter only mentions his name once in the first 30 or so issues. What I failed to mention was that while Uncle Ben doesn't have a proper physical presence, he still lives on in Peter as some sort of unspoken spiritual force. Just because his name isn't invoked every 5 minutes like he's Jesus, it doesn't take away from the lesson Peter learned. His actions still speak for themselves. Before Uncle Ben's death, Peter's a bit of a dick, and honestly it's not his fault. He's still a good kid on the inside, you know, he doesn't want to hurt anyone, but after years of bullying and rejection, being shamed for any signs of emotional vulnerability, he just doesn't care anymore. Why should he go out and help the world if the world has been so unkind to him? And so when that thief runs past him and the guard is shouting at him to do something, he doesn't just let the thief go on a whim. "Oh, sorry officer, I was feeling a bit silly." You know, it's this apathy towards the world, this way of thinking he's been almost conditioned into. When Uncle Ben eats lead in his own home, it allows Peter to see the danger of his selfish behaviour, and he learns that with great power comes great responsibility. But don't take the power part literally, because it's not about the actual spider powers. Sure, they're pretty helpful, but they're really just a tool to let him realise his actual power, the power to care. Spider powers or not, if you've been instilled with kindness and empathy, intelligence, resilience, if you have these good qualities inside you, don't keep them to yourself, you greedy bitch. However, Peter's lived experiences, his years of bullying, have shaped his instincts. His selfishness is like a survival mechanism, so while he has all those good qualities, those given to him by Aunt May and Uncle Ben, sharing them doesn't come naturally to him. Peter's arc isn't to become a good person, it's learning to share that good person that was already in him. This lesson is elaborated on in Amazing Spider-Man issue 500, in which, thanks to some Doctor Strange magic, Peter is able to talk to Uncle Ben on the night that he died. As Uncle Ben says to him, "We all mess up sometimes. It's not only inevitable, I think maybe it's even necessary. You know what would disappoint me? If you didn't reach for the kind of life I wanted for you, if you settled for less because you were afraid of reaching for more, if you walked away from what you believe even once." Not only is this rather touching, because, you know, it's his dead uncle, but it also illustrates the heart of power and responsibility. Ironically, by being selfish, Peter wasn't actually serving himself. He wasn't allowing himself to reach his full potential and give what he had to offer the world.
You always have a choice, Peter.
I have a choice.
He does have a choice. He can choose to take the easy path and accept what society has shaped him out to be, Or he can choose to rise above that and reach for more. That's the core of Spider-Man, choosing to be better, not because it comes easy to you, but because it's right. Despite only being 11 pages long, Spider-Man's origin story is a perfect example of solid, albeit simple storytelling. If you want to prove that with great power comes great responsibility, you take the opposite message of that, and you prove why it is flawed through the character's actions. It's a bit like a debate. You don't shy away from your opponent's message, you take it head on, and in doing so you strengthen your own message, which ultimately leads to a better story. Seems simple enough. But wait a minute. This whole lesson of power and responsibility comes from this moment, right? He could have stopped the thief, he didn't stop the thief, he spends the rest of his life regretting that he didn't stop the thief. But should he have actually stopped him?
What the hell's the matter with you? You let him go!
Oh yeah, sure, this civilian should have stopped the armed criminal from escaping instead of, I don't know, prioritizing his own safety and letting the right people do their jobs? Like you? Now the point of this scene is to illustrate why Peter's selfish behaviour is so bad, like, in the grand scheme of his life. However, in this specific moment, Peter had never been in an actual life or death fight, nor is he immune to being shot in the face. If he had stepped in, he could have ended up being killed, or someone else for that matter. While this isn't the point of the scene, and he was operating with selfish intentions, he still technically made the right decision with the information available to him. The weight of Uncle Ben's death does not lie on Peter's shoulders. There are a number of factors at play, like how the thief just so happened to choose that specific house, or how Uncle Ben just so happened to fight back instead of doing what the thief told him to do. As Peter has been explicitly told before, it wasn't his fault. But the fact Peter blames himself is a core aspect of his character. A lot of the emotional conflict in the series is brought on by him just being too hard on himself, and this is also a result of his lived experience. It's this self-doubt, this self-blame that almost eats him from the inside. This acts as a roadblock between power and responsibility. When Peter puts all the blame on himself and he thinks he doesn't have what it takes, he's neglecting his own power, and in doing so he can't carry out his responsibility to others. Overcoming this self-doubt and learning to take care of himself is a very common theme in Spider-Man stories. The most famous example is probably Spider-Man 2, which in itself is a loose adaptation of Amazing Spider-Man issue 50. Another example, Amazing Spider-Man issue 33, you know, the really iconic scene where he lifts up the machinery while hyping himself up to the extreme. In order to save Aunt May, he must first believe in his own strength, both physically and mentally. He must fight beyond what he previously thought he was capable of, adapted to perfection in Homecoming, by the way. The thing about Peter's flaws, his self-doubt, his selfishness, is that they're all very human. So while the point of these stories is to prove this behaviour wrong, to overcome it, you can still sympathise with him enough to see how he got these flaws in the first place. This is what makes Spider-Man such an important source of social change. We can identify with these flaws, and so when the story challenges them and offers us a solution, it allows us to change ourselves. Here's a little segue. Do you remember in 2016 when Captain America was revealed to be a Hydra sleeper agent and everyone was freaking out? Then, as a joke, people started making similar plot twists for other superheroes. I shot my parents. I could see the whole time. And then you have Spider-Man who says, "F*** responsibility." Now, I hate to analyse a meme, but I think the reason I found this so funny at the time was, it's not like he's saying, I shot Uncle Ben, or anything. He's taking this entire, intangible concept, everything that makes up who he is, everything that he's learned over decades, and one day, for no reason at all, he's just like, f*** it, completely unprovoked. Now this is meant to be a joke. The humour lies in the fact that he would never do this. But the more I think about it, the more that this perfectly represents this. Peter's actions in One More Day are inherently selfish. He's taking the easy way out, giving in to his selfish instincts, and it's because he doesn't believe in his own power. To make it worse, he's also sacrificing his potential. He's preserving the past at the cost of the future, refusing to move forward and grow because he's afraid. This retcon will regress the self-actualization he has and could have continued to achieve, which is the opposite of Uncle Ben's lesson. This here isn't the problem, not entirely. Like I said, Spider-Man is meant to get it wrong. He's meant to let the thief go. He's meant to give in to guilt and self-doubt and all that. But there's always the promise that it'll be proven wrong later. The thing about One More Day is that this never happens. It's just one never-ending low point. In part 3 of the story, Mephisto is roasting Peter, going on about how he's selfish, how he puts his pain at the centre of the universe. This is a somewhat accurate, if not rather harsh description of Peter's personality, his struggle to balance selfishness with selflessness, what comes naturally to him versus what's right. This here is meant to be the counterpoint, right? What Mephisto is saying, Peter will have to overcome as he has time and time again. But the very nature of One More Day doesn't allow for this. Because this story exists to reset the timeline, because it needs Mephisto to be right, This argument can't be challenged. Peter overcoming this internal conflict would mean he wouldn't make the deal, which wouldn't yield the result that Marvel editorial wanted. And it tries to be about power and responsibility. You know, Peter is hyped up, he's told he has what it takes to make this difficult decision. You have your power. He says he's going to take the blame for what happened to Aunt May, that this deal is the right thing to do. They literally mention the word responsibility, but people aren't stupid. You can tell if a story isn't motivated by a strong idea. You may not be able to articulate how you can tell, but you can certainly express outrage. The dialogue may be well written, the art, the paneling, everything on the surface may be totally fine, but underneath it lacks that strong motivating idea. Anything remotely interesting that this story is trying to say is made obsolete by its ending. Marvel publishes stories that will be read by hundreds of thousands of people. You do have a responsibility when choosing what message you're going to convey. Is this the message you really want to express? That you can't make peace with the inevitable death of your loved ones? That you should give in to grief? That you should accept the idea that trauma locks you in the past rather than be able to process it? If anything, it's a tragedy. It's a villain arc. Peter is given all of these opportunities, all of these warning signs, but he ignores them out of frustration and in doing so seals his fate. He meets his end at the hand of his enemy, and his death isn't mourned but instead celebrated as this bittersweet victory. So sure, you could say there's an arc, but it's one that paints Peter as the villain. And if you want to tell that sort of story, maybe don't choose Spider-Man to do it. Okay, so it's all very sad. Peter and MJ have their souls ripped apart in what is probably the worst divorce in human history. But this is Spider-Man. He's not meant to have it easy. He's meant to have that element of personal tragedy that's always lurking around the corner. Him suffering, him losing people he cares about, that's meant to be a good thing, right? And yes, Peter's suffering, Peter being miserable is meant to be part of his life, but it's never the whole picture. One More Day is missing yet another element of Spider-Man, and I think this can be best demonstrated through the death of his first love, Gwen Stacy. Now, spoilers, but everyone knows that Gwen dies. If you didn't already know that from the comics, you'll know it from Amazing Spider-Man 2, watching Gwen's spine snap like a bundle of sticks, but before you have any time to process it, Kendrick Lamar starts playing out of nowhere and you're like, I don't know what I'm feeling right now. Gwen's death is a great example of personal tragedy without sacrificing Peter's principles. Peter wholeheartedly believes that he can save Gwen, that he's the man for the job, and he's hyping himself up right to the last minute, giving it everything he's got. He believes in his power, and he uses it to carry out its responsibility to Gwen. And yet, Gwen still dies. Not because Peter wasn't good enough, not because he betrayed his principles, but because these things just happen. It's a fact of life. Tragedy can come without warning, and there's nothing you can do. After Gwen dies, Peter doesn't blame himself for what happened. No, really, he's been put through numerous trials before. Having fought this self-doubt again and again, he's learned to set reasonable expectations for himself. He's already been blamed for the death of Captain Stacy, he's already had the whole world hating on him, and he's come out the other side, with a new sense of emotional maturity. So he doesn't blame himself, no, instead what's bothering him is just how f***ing alone he feels. How miserable the absence of Gwen has made him, regardless of whether he could have stopped it or not. This is perhaps the worst period of his entire life. He leans into his selfish side, putting his pain first and neglecting others because of it. There's rarely a hint of happiness, and he is bitter and cruel to those he loves. Harry's also going through it, he's begging Peter, please help me, only for Peter to be like, nah, you're on your own, mate. An ironic positive ending is where, yes, we lost some things, the opposing forces were somewhat triumphant, but in the end, those good values were always stronger. And I think this perfectly describes Spider-Man. Yes, some stories will end on a miserable note, but it's always building to a conclusion later down the line that's positive over negative. You'll eventually get that ironic positive ending, that triumph over grief, that liberation of despair. And there is no more appropriate example of this than one of my favourite comics of all time, Spider-Man Blue. It was written in the early 2000s, but it takes place during the late 60s, early 70s era and expands upon Peter and Gwen's relationship. It's beautiful, it's heartbreaking, and really encapsulates what Gwen's death meant to Peter. Each issue follows a pattern, which can pretty much be boiled down to a bad thing happens, but it ultimately leads to a good thing. Peter has a fight with the Green Goblin, and yes, it's quite traumatic, but it eventually leads him getting closer to Harry, and as a result, Gwen. When Peter's apartment is invaded by Kraven the Hunter, yeah, it sucks, but it ultimately leads to his and Gwen's first kiss. Bad before good. As Peter says, losing Gwen was the hardest thing that happened to him. His pain didn't come from a place of self-loathing, but more frustration at the random cruelty of the universe. He thought all hope was lost and that he could never love again. But Peter is proven wrong, when at the end of the last issue, we cut forward to the present day, in which Peter has married Mary Jane and has moved on with his life. He looks back on the past not just with regret, but through a bittersweet lens, and it's not all miserable. It may have taken him a long time, and I mean a long, long time, but eventually he's able to recognise that some things have to get worse before they get better, and that life can be great. This also ties into the conversation with Uncle Ben. When Peter tries to apologise for letting Ben die and tries to tell him everything that's happened, Uncle Ben doesn't care. Because as he says, we all go through pain and we lose people we care about because it's the price of being human. But at the end of the day, are you happy, Peter? And the answer is, yeah. He's lucky enough to have family and friends to support him through these dark times, and he's learned to appreciate all that he has. Everyone knows that grief is bad. Like, you already know it's going to be bad, everyone says it's going to be bad, but it's only once you've gone through it yourself that you can truly appreciate just how soul-crushing it is. Nothing can prepare you for it. But at the same time, grief can make you appreciate what you had in a way that nothing else can. Even if there's not much to hold on to, even if it's just the way someone smiled or a fleeting moment of happiness. That's what makes Spider-Man so inspiring and relatable. Not that he has money problems or bad luck, but that he finds a way past those problems and grows beyond grief. He doesn't just endure his life, he embraces it. This reflection of dark times, this looking back on the past through a new lens, is so key to the character and can be used to show how much he's grown. One More Day, once again by design, can't offer this. Peter blames himself for Aunt May's death, completely ignoring the fact that she was the one who pushed for his unmasking and was perfectly capable of dealing with the consequences. Peter is not setting realistic expectations for himself, he's not demonstrating the emotional maturity he was established to have decades earlier. His concern is that he'll never live with Aunt May's death, that he'll break himself in two. Are we forgetting Gwen Stacy? Aunt May is gone. Sure, this is terrible, but Peter, listen. You still have MJ. You still have the good there, and by making this deal, you're putting that good at risk. Mephisto is a bad guy. He's a fucking hell demon. You can't trust what he says. You'll end up with nothing. Peter, Peter. This leads to another problem with One More Day. The fact that it serves as a conclusion. This is the end of writer J. Michael Straczynski's run, and the slate is wiped clean for the next age of stories. In the past, when Peter would have a sad ending, it wasn't like the ending of the entire conflict. You'd eventually get that ironic positive ending. But this is ironic negative at best, if not just outright miserable. Peter has lost a part of his heart. His soul is crying out for a love he now never even knew existed. And that's it. Because Peter's memories of this event are erased, there's no room for reflection. This liberation of grief that is so key to the character is nowhere to be found. Peter spent years trying to make sense of Gwen's death, this senseless tragedy, and the closest he got was bad before good. 15 years down the line, if things still haven't got better, if Peter is still miserable from this thing he can't remember or reflect on, it's like Gwen died for nothing. There is no good before bad, there's just bad and then some. Marvel can't undo One More Day or bring some cathartic resolution to it because they don't see it as a tragedy. Through the story's placement in the wider narrative, it's framed as this ironic positive, this bittersweet ending that nicely rounded off the end of an era. But it's not. It's miserable. The Peter Parker of today has to endure his life, but he can't embrace it. Because for some reason, Marvel would rather let him suffer than let his good values triumph. Why do I go to read the latest Spider-Man issue and MJ is like married to this other guy and has kids, all while Peter rots away in misery? Top 3 Spider-Man villains of all time, fucking Paul. Now so far I'll admit I haven't really been fair to Peter, or the story itself, because the decision to accept Mephisto's deal didn't just lie with him, but MJ as well. It's a choice they both agree on. In fact, when Peter has his doubts, when he thinks, actually maybe I can live with this, maybe we don't have to sacrifice our marriage, it's MJ who pushes for them to make the deal. You could say that it's MJ's fault. I mean, you could say that, but you'd be fucking wrong. Another common criticism of One More Day is how it severely mistreats MJ as a character. How it neglects not only the value she's supposed to give to Peter, but more importantly the value she gives to herself. She gets really f***ed over by this. Now MJ plays a vital role in helping Peter out of his depression. After Gwen dies, MJ tries to comfort Peter, but he won't let her. At this point, MJ had only been depicted as this happy-go-lucky party girl who never took anything seriously, so the fact that she's trying to show some emotional maturity is almost laughable to him. She doesn't know what real grief is like, this is all just a show, and so he tells her to leave him alone and let him grieve in peace. This here is the turning point for MJ's character. What Peter forgot was that Gwen was MJ's friend too. She is also going through her fair share of grief, and it would have been easy for her to accept Peter's wishes, to leave him behind and go take care of herself. But she doesn't. Not only does she refuse to leave, she refuses to let herself be defined by this one-note stereotype any longer. As it turns out, MJ already knows what it's like to be alone, to feel isolated from the people you're supposed to care about. She had what you could call a non-traditional childhood, she had a ton of family problems, her party girl persona is really just a survival instinct, a front to lessen the emotional weight she carries every day. And what does she do with all these traumatic experiences? She converts them into empathy, into kindness, and she uses them to better understand those around her. It doesn't come naturally to her, she's used to hiding, to laughing away at her own problems, but she still helps Peter anyway. She gets him out of that darkness because it's the right thing to do, and she cares about him. Oh my god, it's power and responsibility! What a perfect match for Peter. Someone who understands his core principles on such a deep level, but not because she's trying to be like him or just trying to understand him, but because she independently arrived at this conclusion through the course of her own life. Don't get me wrong, it's not all deep chats and soul-bonding conversations. A lot of the time MJ just shows up for the sake of it, to talk about something trivial, and that's just as important. She's making sure he knows she's there for him, and he doesn't have to share his deepest, darkest thoughts all the time, but she'll be there when he does. Once she helps Peter out of that depressive state, Peter returns the favour. He's able to give back to MJ in a way that helps her recognise her own value, her own power. And he doesn't try and solve her problems for her, he just makes sure she has the support she needs to make her own decisions. He provides the voice of reason, the shoulder to cry on, and in doing so, brings out a courage she didn't know she had. And so when Peter and MJ tied the knot in 1987, it wasn't just a cute moment where they're surrounded by their friends and family and it's a happy, wholesome time. I mean, yeah, that was pretty nice. But it was because two characters you were heavily invested in, these two people who've done so much for each other, who complete each other, have a moment of pure happiness after all they've been through. And this happiness didn't come from nowhere, they earned it together. Now, I'd kick myself if I didn't bring this next thing up. I would love to say that this wedding came naturally from the characters, but no, they didn't do it for that reason. They did it for f***ing money! After Stan Lee stopped writing The Amazing Spider-Man, he went on to create a newspaper strip. This was also called The Amazing Spider-Man, except it took place in a separate continuity and was released daily in multiple newspapers. Around the mid-80s, the circulation of the strip had started to decline, and so Stan Lee decided that he could cause some publicity by marrying the main characters together. Jim Shooter, editor of Marvel Comics at the time, is like, wait a minute. What about us? We're the main series, why are we getting scooped by this newspaper strip? However, in the main series, Peter and MJ weren't even dating at the time. They still shared a deep, emotional connection with each other, but they decided they worked better as friends. So the creative team had 3-4 issues to go from Peter and MJ being friends to going on their honeymoon. Thus, Amazing Spider-Man issue 290 opens with Peter thinking, there's something missing in my life. Ah, I know, it's because I'm not married to Mary Jane, and then instantly proposes to her and she's like, what? Now, reading this story with the context of what they were trying to do, trying to capture this publicity in such a short amount of time, it does feel rather abrupt. In fact, MJ points out in the story that they decided to become friends like a minute ago. Why is he changing his mind all of a sudden now? I think what saves it from appearing totally out of left field is that the seeds had been planted years before. Peter and MJ already had a history of romance up to a decade prior to their eventual marriage. He had proposed to her before, so it doesn't seem that bizarre that he'd want to try again. Sure, from one issue to the next, it's admittedly rushed, but in the bigger picture, it makes sense for them. They've both learned not to keep their problems to themselves, they've recognised this pure, unconditional love for each other that makes them more alive. A marriage is just a symbol, a commitment to those things. It works naturally in the grand scheme of things, they just had to speedrun it in the end. Peter and MJ would spend the next 20 years together as a married couple, and during this time they go through a lot of turmoil. Both of them are constantly in danger, they have their own personal issues. There's still the right amount of personal tragedy that is so key to Spider-Man. But rarely do the stakes ever lie in the marriage itself. Sometimes there'll be hiccups and they'll fall out like any couple does. As Peter once said to her after a heated argument, "The world's trying to tear you apart, me apart. Let's not let it tear us apart." The thing about having someone like this is that, I don't know, if a certain family member dies, you'll have someone to get through that night with, someone to lessen the blow that grief delivers. Now, by certain family member, I'm of course referring to Aunt May, but not in the way you'd expect. No, instead what I'm referring to is Amazing Spider-Man issue 400, which is what I would consider the real death of Aunt May. Now obviously they've retconned this, given that Aunt May went on to live and then got shot in Civil War, but on its own, this issue is an absolutely beautiful send-off to a character that had been around for almost 30 years. At this point, Aunt May was probably like 110 years old. She'd fought pretty much every illness in the book, and if they kept her around any longer, they'd have to start inventing new illnesses, and so the Marvel creative team decided that it was time for Aunt May's old age to catch up with her. In a very heartfelt moment, executed with the utmost sincerity, Aunt May assures Peter that she's had a good life, that she's at peace, and he needs to move on. And while this is very touching, I'd say the most important part isn't the moment itself, but how Peter deals with it afterwards. Writer J.M. DeMatteis puts it beautifully. A lesser man would have crumbled under the strain, but not Peter Parker. He's been to the edge of the abyss, fought his way back, and he's not making that journey again. He realises that despite the tumult of the last year, or perhaps because of it, he's never had so much hope. That, combined with the promise of new life growing inside Mary Jane, fills him with a sense of appreciative awe and a determination not just to survive, but triumph. He believes to the bottom of his soul that he and Mary Jane will finally have their happily ever after. Not only is this amazingly written, it's a testament to the sheer value Peter puts in MJ. He's not emotionally invincible, but he can get through those hard times, these inevitabilities of life, because of her. I think that all of the Spider-Man stories from the 60s up until the late 90s can be contextualized into this one big narrative. The story of a young boy who thought he had to go it alone and kept his pain to himself. He suffered more than he could handle, but he adapted, he grew, and eventually found comfort in someone else. It may have taken him years and years, but finally he accepted that he didn't have to go it alone anymore. Peter's been at this a long time. Pain may still affect him, but it doesn't control him anymore. He may overthink, but never at the expense of the people who are still with him. Mephisto comes knocking, offers Peter a deal. I'll save your aunt. I'll erase your future daughter from existence. But, as Peter rightfully points out, he has a responsibility to his wife. He needs to talk it through with her first. And maybe, consider the major ramifications for altering not only the history of their relationship, but the memories of the entire world. And so, Peter and MJ are talking it through, and MJ points out that what if this is May's time to go? As previously established, she's lived a good, long life, and she was more than happy to take responsibility for Peter's unmasking. What if this is the right thing to do? And the most frustrating part is, Peter knows this, and while he does acknowledge the guilt that it'll bring him and, he'll probably break in two or whatever, he tosses that aside and says, actually MJ, if I'm here with you and that we have each other, maybe I could live with this. Maybe we could get through Aunt May's death together. On a surface level, this is Peter respecting his duty to MJ, this is him holding on to everything he's learned. However, this is not as noble or as wholesome as he thinks it is. You can't say, oh yeah, my life won't be worth living, my soul will be crushed, I'll always be carrying around this emotional baggage that will make my life a living hell and I'll always be miserable, but, don't worry about it. That's not fair. What is she supposed to think? And so MJ, understandably not wanting her husband to drown in misery for the rest of his life, not really buying the whole I'll be fine part, insists to Mephisto that they go through with the deal. She puts her life in the devil's hands. She doesn't know what he's gonna do. He's the devil! She's sacrificing this person she's developed into, this more emotionally honest, courageous person, and puts her husband before herself. She's the only one who's acting somewhat in character here, and she suffers for it. Way back in issue 122, MJ could have accepted Peter's wishes and left him alone. But she didn't. She didn't give him what he thought he wanted, she gave him what he needed. Hope, love, and stability in a time where that seemed impossible to him. This is Peter's chance to give MJ the same respect. To recognise that she's only doing this for him, that she doesn't actually want to follow through with this, and that he shouldn't take her wishes at face value. Hey MJ, believe it or not, I actually did mean what I said about getting through this guilt with you, and I'm not going to let you throw your life away, your potential, this very bond that completes you. But no, he stands by, doesn't challenge her, and agrees to the deal. Spider-Man of all people stands by and doesn't step in, letting his wife make the hard decision for him. MJ believes in her heart that they will find each other again, and that's all that she can do because her husband has failed his duty to her. But this deal, what are the specifics of this deal? Because as Mephisto describes, and we'll take him at his word here, the story does for some reason, so we will as well. The only thing that changes is that they weren't married. All the stories will remain exactly the same, it's just the technicality of the marriage. So what changes? The legal document wasn't the thing that drew them together. Like I said, that was just a rushed storyline. Marriage or not, the bond was there already. This shouldn't change anything. And yet, apparently, in this new timeline, a legal document was all that stood between MJ and leaving Peter. I wish I was strong enough to be with you, Peter, but I'm not, because I now, for some magic reason, hold so much more value in the New York State domestic relations legislation than I do my own self-confidence and the value I once placed in our relationship. Goodbye. The MJ who knew what she was getting into, who always carried such strength and always stood by her husband's side, that MJ wouldn't do the things that this plot needs her to do. And so for her to bail on him, and bail on herself, Marvel has no other choice but character assassination. And it's all because... well, actually, that's a good point. Why were these characters mistreated? Why did this whole thing exist in the first place? For fun? Now, as many of you might know, One More Day is the result of an editorial mandate placed by this man. If you've been on my channel for a bit, you'll know I've made some jokes at his expense. He's been roasted to oblivion on this thing, okay? We can criticize him without villainizing him. I think why One More Day exists can be boiled down to one main thing. Joe Quesada was trying to solve a problem Marvel had since the 70s. You see, I think one of the most appealing things about Spider-Man that I think a lot of people overlook is change. And I don't just mean life lessons, I mean he physically reaches different points in his life. He graduates high school, university, he moves out, he gets married, he prepares for fatherhood, and yes, he's scared and he gets anxious about crossing these thresholds, but he still bears up and does it anyway. Now, I've already brought up the late 60s, early 70s era of Spider-Man, you know, Peter's college days with Gwen, Flash, Harry, and MJ, and it would be an understatement to say that I absolutely adore this era. The series is still in its early days, but by this point Stan Lee has really figured out what he's doing. The tone feels more grounded and mature than the previous era, but it's still wacky and fun sometimes, and it makes me nostalgic for a time period I didn't actually live in, and yeah, I love it to death. But a great thing about this era is that it actively welcomed change. Peter gets a whole new supporting cast. He moves out of Aunt May's house, he starts exploring romantically, not sure if he wants to go out with Gwen or Mary Jane, but the thing about these changes is that they were all very natural. When you start university, of course you're going to make new friends. As you mature into an adult, you'll move out and you'll move on from your high school crushes to pursue more serious relationships. These early Spider-Man comics pretty much progressed in real time. In Stan Lee's original run, which spanned about 8 years, Peter completed all of high school and had gotten through pretty much all of university. Despite all the chaos, the trajectory of his life was going pretty smoothly, and the story was setting him up to get married to Gwen. After Stan Lee left, things started to slow down. This didn't come at the cost of the character, but they were putting up these little roadblocks. You had Gwen's death so that Peter couldn't get married, he stayed a bit longer in university, and then when he did graduate, the door was left open for him to return. I think they must have realised that he was growing up a little bit too quickly, and that they needed to preserve the longevity of their best-selling character. And sure, things weren't moving at the same rate, but they were still going somewhere. I want to draw your attention to a moment in Amazing Spider-Man issue 314. Peter and MJ have been evicted from their apartment and thrown out on the street. It's the middle of winter, they've no idea what they're going to do, but fortunately Aunt May comes along. Aunt May offers Peter his old room back, and says that Peter and MJ can move in with her for as long as they want. While Peter is very appreciative of this, he declines the offer, opting to remain homeless instead of moving back with his aunt. As he explains to MJ, moving back in is a step backwards he doesn't want to take. It would compromise the independence he's built for himself as an adult. I think this scene perfectly represents the problem Marvel had. You have a character whose motivations are based on his own personal growth, but he's controlled by a company that can't let him grow up. So Marvel have to find ways of preserving his youth, of slowing down time, while also staying true to the element of change that's so important to him. So we continue on from the 80s into the 90s, and MJ reveals that she is pregnant. Peter is over the moon. This is another new stage in his life. It's the chance for him to pass down everything he's learned, and he's going to be the best father ever. There's this brilliant site called The Life of Riley, which documents all of the behind-the-scenes chaos of 90s Spider-Man according to writer/editor Glenn Greenberg. Basically, the original plan was to have Peter's identical clone Ben Reilly take his place as the mainstream Spider-Man. This might seem like a stupid idea on paper, but after seeing Ben's character development in such a short amount of time, seeing how Peter and Ben treat each other as brothers and have a great deal of love for one another, I really think it could have worked. It wouldn't have been my first pitch, but it would have let Peter continue the trajectory of his life. Now, they really almost followed through with this. They had Peter lose his powers, hang up the costume, meanwhile Ben took his place and called himself Spider-Man. This, however, led to a lot of backlash from fans, and even some of the Marvel staff weren't on board. They couldn't just continue with their plan without losing a large group of customers, but at the same time they'd spent so long setting everything up, so they couldn't just, reverse it. It's worth noting that one idea was to have a time travel plot with Mephisto to retcon the last 5 years. At least then they had the sense that it was a bad idea. Instead, they opted to kill off Ben, and perhaps more tragically, Peter and MJ's unborn child. This failure to turn Peter into a father had left the staff at Marvel, especially the editor-in-chief at the time, reluctant to let Peter grow up anymore or even acknowledge the baby going forward. So we get to the turn of the century. Joe Quesada becomes editor-in-chief, and he inherits this problem that Marvel have had for the past 30 years. In his own words, if Spidey grows old and dies off with their readership, then that's it. He'll be done and gone, never to be enjoyed by future comic fans. If we keep Spidey rejuvenated and relatable to fans on the horizon, we can manage to do that and still keep him enjoyable to those that have been following his adventures for years. At the end of the day, my job is to keep these characters fresh and ready for every fan that walks through the door, while also planning for the future and hopefully an even larger fan base. So Quesada's not looking to slow things down, he instead wants to preserve the longevity for the next couple decades. And how does he think to do that? By returning to the late 60s, early 70s era. He considers this to be the golden age of Spider-Man, the way things should be. And hey, I get it. I love that era too. But as it turns out, the reason Quesada loves this era is very different from mine. What's good for one's life doesn't always make for great stories when the heart of your character's universe is drama. We all want Peter to catch a break and to settle down and have happiness in his life. But that isn't what we really want. If that actually happened, people would stop caring about Spider-Man. Sure, he can have a girlfriend, that adds something to his story, but a married Peter just cuts off too many avenues for good soap opera. After a while, there's only so much tension you can bring into Peter and MJ's marriage before you make him seem like a louse of a husband or her like a bickering wife. In contrast, you can only play them as a happy-go-lucky couple for so long. That adds up to zero tension within the relationship and takes away a crucial element of Spider-Man stories. The soap opera. Here, Quesada is referring to all of the interpersonal conflict in the college days. Peter's tension with Harry and MJ, Flash and Gwen. You know, everyone loves each other while also being at each other's throats half the time. It makes for some good drama, and that's what Quesada considers so special, so unique about this era. I, on the other hand, disagree. Part of what made the 70s era so special is that it built upon the stuff that was already there. It didn't treat the previous era as this special template to forever hold on to. It used it as a base to expand from. This drama, this conflict between the characters, was only one side of the coin. It was in reaction to what had come before, and it was an opportunity for Peter to grow. When this soap opera, as Quesada calls it, was eventually phased out, it was a sign of emotional maturity. Peter had learned to emotionally invest in other people, and so there was less room for such conflicts. There are decades worth of examples of how to tell genuinely compelling, high-stakes stories while still having Spider-Man be happily married. In fact, some of the most acclaimed Spider-Man stories of all time come from when the marriage was still intact. Like I said, the stakes don't have to lie in Peter and MJ's relationship, and that's because of Peter's development as a character. Either Quesada didn't recognise this, or he didn't deem it important enough to consider when rebooting the entire Spider-Man universe. Because time may have been reverted back to the 70s on a surface level, but the way it's implemented completely misses what made that era, and the eras that followed it, so special. Now, from the way his colleagues talk about him, Quesada does have a genuine love for the history of the character. This wasn't an act of malice, he wasn't trying to sabotage, he was just doing his job. At the end of the day, it comes down to a difference in opinion. Or more, his opinion and then everyone else's. This is ultimately why this story feels so empty, so void of meaning, and has to assassinate its characters to fulfill its goal. Because it doesn't stem naturally from the character's motivations, it's not in reaction to what came before, it's just motivated by a f***ed up hybrid of financial interest and one guy's opinion on how things should be. I guess it's cool that it was one artist's vision, you know, it was this person who really cares about the character and not think-tanked by this group of money-hungry executives, but like, it still sucks. Spider-Man's development had been slowing down exponentially since the 70s. One More Day wasn't the source of the downfall, it was just the flattening of the curve. That final blow that was painful, yet inevitable. When I think of why we express outrage at a piece of media, part of it is because we're being denied the values we've come to expect. The self-actualization, the catharsis for our own problems, intimacy, power, responsibility. If these values are missing in a Spider-Man story, or God forbid, contradicted, it's gonna piss you off. But I'd say another large part of it is concern for the future. People want to protect what they hold dear. If you care about Spider-Man, and a certain story threatens the future of this character, you're going to want to voice that. You're going to want to stop it. Because flash forward to the present day, we've had lots of amazing, heartfelt Spider-Man stories from the modern age, but in the bigger picture, what's changed? Yeah, he gets his mind swapped, he becomes a CEO, he gets back with MJ again and again, but it never sticks. He's still living in a crappy apartment, he's still estranged from the people he loves, he's going back to college again. Sure, Spider-Man may be around for the next, hell, forever, but if that weight, that commitment to change is no longer around, is it really the same Spider-Man? While it might be a bit overdramatic to say, the Spider-Man that I once knew, this emotionally mature, hopeful, inspiring character who valued his own progress, both in the physical world and spiritually, this person who helped the people he cared about reach their own potentials, this person who truly understood power and responsibility, that Spider-Man is dead. Such a f***ing downer, jeez.